formalities at the beginning as we used to, which is good. Well, Chairman Payne is delayed, so I will be sharing here today. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here. It's kind of an unusual thing. Haven't been on the committee a long time and observed these hearings, but I haven't seen too many times when rail labor, railroad shippers, and Amtrak are all raising similar concerns about the way the freight rail industry is operating. And to say that I'm concerned and share their concerns is an understatement. The STB, Surface Transportation Board, is heavily focused on ensuring the economic vitality of the railroads when it should be supporting a balanced national freight rail system that serves its customers well. 42 years after Staggers, at that point, the freight industry was in very dire straits. 27 years after Congress replaced the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission, with the Surface Transportation Board, the balance of power has swung too far. Wall Street is destroying the freight rail industry, as they are many other industries in the United States of America, as they did when they put pressure on Boeing, and we ended up with horrible tragedies. I used to say, well, we have the greatest freight network in the world, and it's not, and it can be and not be incompatible with a decent passenger rail network. Unfortunately, the state of the freight rail industry is deteriorating, all after the model of the not mourned Hunter Harrison, who came up with the idea of precision scheduled railroading, i.e., just look at the bottom line, not the efficiency for your shippers, not the safety of your railroad, and it has spread like a disease through the industry since he corrupted CSX. It's very sad. I mean, you can't just infinitely, increase your quarterly profits with ever-decreasing operating ratios. So far, freight rail has laid off nearly 1/3 of their workforce since 2015. They've parked locomotives, closed rail yards, causing a number of shippers to temporarily close plants and facilities due to erratic rail service. The rail workforce strains under pressures to do more with less. Shrunken employee count continues to unreliable shipper service, worker fatigue, low morale. At the same time, the investors on Wall Street have demanded stock buybacks, nonstop returns on investment. Pandemic has exacerbated the effects of pressure that began years ago to cut. Now, after years of shrinking footprints in workforce, Class 1s find they have cut too far. They're reopening facilities they closed to save costs and desperately trying to rehire workers who have seen the industry change before their eyes. The Class 1s left themselves so little cushion and been unable to adjust for winter in Chicago, flooding in the Midwest, Southeast, wildfires in the West. Weather events like these happen every year. They're getting worse due to climate change, and yet they are consistently used as an excuse for degrading service. Our national policy to reduce the transport sector's carbon emissions cannot be achieved if the freight railroads are cutting service to less lucrative shippers. We need the freight railroads to be serving more customers at a time when the overall volume of goods transported in the country is skyrocketing. Railroads consistently tell us how if 25% of the truck traffic moving at 750 miles went by rail, it said greenhouse gas emissions. I agree with that goal. We've all seen the ads on television. They are more efficient, but you can't be part of the solution if you're following just the stock ticker price and the pressures of Wall Street. According to the Surface Transportation Board, outside of coal, the railroads have lost market share to trucks for the past 15 years. They're cherry picking only the most profitable routes, working to make the less profitable routes as unappealing as possible, and forcing that freight to trucks. I've spent my concern raising concerns about Wall Street and its attack on American industry and American workers. Unfortunately, now it has come to freight rail. I want to have a healthy and the best, most robust freight rail market in the world, keeping trucks off the road. And I do want to have a viable passenger rail network. These two things do not need to be incompatible. And I believe the Surface Transportation Board is going to play a very key role in moving us in that direction. With that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I would now recognize Ranking Member Crawford's opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you covering down for your colleague, Mr. Payne. I thank him for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for participating today. Today's hearing will examine stakeholder perspectives on the Surface Transportation Board's role in regulating the freight railroad industry and thoughts on the STB's reauthorization. The STB is an independent agency that generally ensures that freight railroads operate in an efficient and economically competitive manner that serves the interests of freight carriers, shippers, and other interested parties. This year, the STB is busier than ever as it reviews an important reciprocal switching rule, a merger between two Class I freight railroads, and potential expansion of Amtrak service. The STB must always weigh any consideration of further industry regulations with the deregulatory spirit of the Staggers Act, which opened the freight industry to increased competition, lower rates, and efficiencies that benefit all interested parties. The STB was last authorized in 2015 through fiscal year 2020. It has subsequently received funding through continuing resolutions. I commend the chair for holding this hearing today and look forward to hearing from our witnesses. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time.
Okay, thank the gentleman for his brevity. And since we have no ranking member, I guess we'll now proceed to witnesses. The first witness will be Chris Jahn, the President and CEO of the American Chemistry Council. Mr. Jahn, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to everyone, Ranking Member Crawford and the other members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about the Surface Transportation Board. Freight rail is critical to supporting the everyday operations of ACC member companies. Our industry is one of the largest customers of freight rail, both by volume and revenue, and we're on track to be an even bigger customer in the future. Now, during his State of the Union address last week, the president talked about a number of new factories being built across the country and the growth of manufacturing jobs here in the United States. The business of chemistry is playing a major role in the revitalization of American manufacturing by making historic levels of investment. Our industry has announced expenditures of more than $200 billion and over 350 chemical manufacturing projects here in the United States. And as a result of this growth, we'll need to transport 200,000 additional rail car shipments per year by 2030. These shipments are important to every segment of the economy and the supply chain. Now, the Staggers Act set a course that helped put the rail industry on the road to recovery and thrive, and that's certainly a good thing. Our members need railroads to be safe, innovative, and successful. And this should give the board the confidence to move ahead on other equally important objectives also mandated by the Staggers Act. Number one, to ensure effective competition among railroads. Number two, maintain reasonable rates in the absence of competition. Fulfilling this mission is vitally important. And railroads, again, need to be financially strong to serve their customers and invest for future growth. At the same time, rail customers need reliable service and reasonable rates. Competition and market forces provide the best means to balance these goals. Policies that promote greater competition within the rail industry help make it a more attractive and viable option to move freight. However, most ACC members and other rail customers do not have competitive options, leaving them without market remedies and solely dependent on the STB when faced with unreasonable rates or service failures. The railroad industry of today looks very different than it did in the 1980s when STB policies were first adopted. And as we go forward, we need to make changes and modernize these rules to adapt along with the rail industry. So let me give you a couple of examples. Consolidation has significantly reduced the number of Class 1 railroads. This in turn has greatly limited access to competitive rail service and led to sharp increases in prices for shipping goods by rail. As one expert recently pointed out, competitive pricing is no longer the norm, and rail customers have to pay a substantial price for the consolidation of railroads' market power. And in fact, the STB's most recent analysis shows that since 2004, rates have increased by 30% more than inflation. Rail rates also outpace increases in long-haul trucking rates over that same time period. In addition to consolidation of mergers, railroads have dramatically changed their operations under the adoption of precision scheduled railroading. These changes have negatively impacted service and harmed many shippers and their customers through additional costs and service failures. Given the impact of these changes, the board must adopt changes that are better equipped to address current challenges and current problems. So we commend STB Chairman Oberman and the other members of the board for working with all stakeholders to develop sensible policy changes. There are several helpful reforms currently underway at the STB, but there's one that I would specifically like to mention today. ACC supports the board's proposal to update its rules on reciprocal switching. This long overdue change would help fulfill one of the primary goals of the Staggers Act by providing greater access to competitive rail service. Canada has demonstrated that a similar approach can promote competition without harming the financial health of the rail companies or the resiliency of the network. We hope that this committee also values the importance of the STB. The new approaches being considered by the board can help support American manufacturing and successful railroads. We'd like to work with you to help ensure the board has the resources it needs to help fulfill its congressional mandate. As the committee moves forward with legislation to reauthorize the STB, ACC urges you to consider the following recommendations. Number one, ensure the board has adequate staff and funding to keep pace with changes to the rail network. Number two, create a better process for collecting data on rail rates. And number three, provide meaningful remedies for rail service failures. We appreciate your leadership on freight rail issues, and we want to work with you in any way we can to help serve shippers and railroads. Thank you.
Exactly 5 minutes. Gentlemen, to be congratulated, and thank you for that substantive testimony. Now we will hear from Dennis Newman, Executive Vice President of Planning Strategy and Accessibility for Amtrak. Mr. Newman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Crawford, and members of this subcommittee. My name is Dennis Newman, and I am Amtrak's Executive Vice President for Strategy, Planning, and Accessibility. On behalf of Amtrak's over 17,000 hardworking and dedicated employees, thank you for allowing me to testify before this subcommittee and share with you Amtrak's views on the reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Board. When Congress created the STB in 1995, passenger rail was simply not top of mind. However, many things have changed since then. First, Congress has made several important updates to the law, providing the STB with new responsibilities regarding Amtrak. Second, the on-time performance of Amtrak trains has deteriorated due to some host railroads ignoring Amtrak's statutory preference rights over freight trains. And third, some railroad mergers have had lasting service impacts on Amtrak train performance and have even jeopardized the continued operation of certain Amtrak routes. Therefore, given what has happened over the past 26 years and how your constituents are often delayed or ignored by some freight railroads, it is critical that the STB be equipped with the tools and resources necessary to help ensure a modern, well-functioning passenger rail network in America. While my written testimony includes a number of STB-related reauthorization proposals, I'd like to highlight three particular items for this subcommittee to consider. First, the STB passenger rail program. In the IIJA, Congress explicitly said that the STB shall establish a passenger rail program and hire up to 10 additional employees to assist the board in doing this important work. Now that the IIJA is law, we need Congress to provide the STB with the federal funds necessary to hire the staff to focus on its responsibilities with respect to passenger rail. such as conducting investigations into substandard performance. That brings me to the second priority I'd like to highlight. It's important to clarify that when a complaint is brought to the board to look into substandard on-time performance, the board will not just treat it as another adversarial proceeding, but rather actively investigate the causes and remedies for that poor performance. This will strengthen an enforcement tool that already exists and clarify the key role that the board can and should play in remedying chronic on-time performance issues. Now, finally, to complement the authority the STB has to investigate substandard performance, the U.S. Attorney General has the authority to bring a case to enforce provisions of the Rail Passenger Service Act, including the preference law. However, as you may expect, the Department of Justice is very busy with a number of other pressing matters, and unfortunately, DOJ has brought only one preference case in 49 years. Therefore, in order to ensure freight railroads are not ignoring the law and delaying your constituents, Amtrak is requesting that we be provided with the ability to also bring a case to district court when our rights are being violated by a host railroad. I want to thank Chairman DeFazio for his hard work on this issue and for including preference enforcement in the Moving Forward Act. As we know, this important provision was ultimately not included in the IIJA, but we cannot give up this fight. I also want to thank Chairman Payne for introducing a standalone bill, H.R. 2937, the Rail Passenger Fairness Act, and I ask members of this subcommittee to support this critical piece of legislation if they are tired of their constituents being delayed by certain freight railroads. With these additional tools and resources, Amtrak believes our passengers and your constituents could finally have the service that they deserve. Now, before I end, I want to stress one really important point. There is absolutely no reason why this nation cannot have both a world-class freight rail network and a modern expanded intercity passenger rail service. Amtrak wants both to succeed. There are many examples of Amtrak and our state partners working cooperatively with host railroads to deliver performance improvements and network expansion with publicly funded investments that benefit all rail users. We have supported rail mergers that will benefit Amtrak performance and facilitate service expansion, like the proposed CPKCS merger. With this subcommittee's help, we believe that building a system that works for both freight and passenger rail is possible. Thank you for all your support thus far and for your time this morning. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, I thank the gentleman. We now turn to Mr. Ian Jeffries, President and CEO of the American Association of American Railroads. Mr. Jeffries, recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Crawford, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here before you today. The past few years have reinforced a key truth. Railroads are an integral part of not only domestic commerce, but also global supply chains. This is no accident. For decades, railroads have invested heavily in their top-rated infrastructure, people, and technology, operating 24/7 to keep goods moving. The numbers tell the story. Average annual investments of $25 billion a year, the train accident rate down 31% since the year 2000, and record or near record volumes of intermodal containers, chemicals, grain, and others in the year 2021. Rail transportation also reduces overall emissions, accounting for just 2% of transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions, while moving 40% of goods. And Class 1 freight rail employees earn total compensation more than 30% higher than the average US employee. As we discuss the STB and economic regulation, let me be clear about one key point. The current regulatory structure makes sense. Rail rates are 44% lower than they were in 1980. And true, rates are modestly higher than they were years ago. Today, roughly equal to where they were in 1990, 32 years ago. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, since 2017 through the end of 2021, the cost to ship by rail has risen at a level approximately half that of long-haul trucking, even though trucks compete on infrastructure subsidized by taxpayer expense. The focus at the STB should be a policy environment to meet projected future freight movement needs without sacrificing the industry's ability to make progress towards safety and environmental goals. DOT projects a 50% increase in freight by 2050. The more of that freight that moves by rail, the better for the environment, for congestion, and for highway degradation. But sufficient capacity is critical to meet this demand. As the statute states, railroads must be able to earn the necessary revenues for the infrastructure and investment needed to meet the present and future demand for rail service. The current market-based regulatory framework developed on a bipartisan basis has been fundamental to the railroad's ability to meet demands to date. This system provides the requisite balance. Railroads can compete for business with an appropriate regulatory backstop where markets fail. Therefore, the current push by some for the STP, B, to enact re-regulatory policies like forced switching is backwards looking and wrong-headed. Make no mistake, forced switching would undermine fluidity, disincentivize investment, and increase emissions, all at a time when supply chains are still experiencing disruptions from the pandemic. Railroads already switch traffic today where it makes sense, and customers can petition for a switch if a railroad shows anti-competitive conduct. The current proposal at the board would remove that standard, transforming switching from a remedy into a right. Some point to rail profitability as justification for a new regulation. This is absurd. Penalizing success is bad public policy and short-sighted, especially when that success has led to consistently high investment levels back into our networks, levels that far exceed other industries represented here today as a percentage of revenue. And that level of investment is necessary to meet forecasted demand. While some members of the largest trade groups might benefit in the short term from forced access, many customers would be harmed, as would the health of the overall rail network. Fortunately, the public record shows broad opposition from leading economists, from rail labor, from passenger rail, environmental advocates, and state and local leaders. Most notably, I sincerely thank the 41 committee members represented here today, both Democrats and Republicans, who wrote to the STB in opposition to a forced switching rule or urged extreme caution in this area. Re-regulation proponents argue that the STB's rate adjudication processes are cumbersome, time-consuming, and expensive. Then Congress should encourage the STB to identify common sense measures that would streamline rate case procedures while also remaining consistent with underlying economic principles and statutory requirements. At the same time, Congress should push the STB to implement cost-benefit analyses to its proceedings, as nearly all other agencies currently do, to understand the real-world impacts of their deliberations. In closing, railroads operate in a highly complex and dynamic market, and we continue to work toward the top-line goals of policymakers, specifically maximizing goods movement and doing so safely. Now is not the time for ill-conceived policy changes that would result in a decrease in freight fluidity and investment. Thank you for your time.
Thank the gentleman. And I would urge witnesses, I know you all have written statements, but if you want to respond to anything that has been stated by another witness in your 5 minutes, that'd be fine with me. It gets rather boring reading your statements before the hearing and then listening to you read your statements again. With that, I would turn to Dennis Pierce, President of Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Crawford, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you this morning. My name is Dennis Pierce. I am president of the oldest trade union in North America, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. I'm also president of the Teamsters Rail Conference, of which BOET is the founding member. My comments today will focus primarily on the Class 1 freight railroads, but before I get into that, I think we should recognize that our members also carry millions of passengers on Amtrak, commuter, and intercity passenger railroads. We should not forget that commuter rail carries 500 million passenger trips a year in the most congested portions of the shared national rail network. I'd like to start by telling you about the members of the BLET. We're in the front row. We're watching why shippers can't get their shipments. But our members are proud and hardworking Americans. They work long, hard careers, moving America's freight safely and efficiently. They are the ultimate essential employee. But there's numerous problems that are forcing our members to reconsider their career choices right now. The way they're being treated on a day in and day out basis, and the way the railroads are being mismanaged, in our opinion, is breeding misery and contempt for Class 1 railroads. The root of these changes, as has already been discussed, generally come from the business model known as precision scheduled railroading. which is neither precise, it's not scheduled, and it's not railroading. Here's just one reason why. The vast majority of our members do not work scheduled jobs. That is a big misconception. They work on call at randomly chosen times dictated by rail management. In many cases, they get little, if any, advance notice of when that call will come. In recent years, they've been subjected to harsher and harsher attendance policies that demand they work day in and day out. These policies subject our members to disciplinary consequences, including termination, even if they take time off because they're too tired or too sick to work safely. These policies are destroying the lives of our members, even to the point of destroying their families. These policies are part of a fewer employees doing more business model that is understaffing the railroads and destroying the supply chain with no regard to the impact on shippers. In sum, today's Class 1's operating model is requiring our members to work longer trains, longer hours, longer round trips with less time at home than they receive in their away from home terminals in hotels in many cases. And if personal issues come up that require them to be at home more than their legal rest, they stand to be disciplined just to tend to their family matters. The workforce is stretched too far, and there is no elasticity to handle even the slightest unplanned event on the railroad, and those things happen daily. The point here is that poor safety and operating practices and burnt out workers only lead to poor and inefficient customer service. This is where the STB can come in. We know the STB is here to ensure that service from the railroads meets the needs of the customers. But PSR has thrown the needs of the customers as well as the needs of the employees out the window. In practical terms, PSR and PSR-like strategies have led to furloughs, and most importantly, longer, slower trains, clogged ports, and a workforce stretched to work beyond the point of safe operations. The current business model is to furlough employees and just make everyone that's left do more. This business model is delaying shipments, leaving store shelves half empty. We've all seen it. But STB can play a role in changing these business practices. BLET believes that STB playing a more active role in regulating railroads can help by handling service complaints in a timelier and more effective manner. Addressing why shipments don't show up on time, which our members see daily, and the related impact on the nation's supply chain is critical to the U.S. economy. One role for Congress would also be to better define the common carrier obligation so that the existing requirements can be effectively enforced by the Surface Transportation Board. This could also come with an attendant clarification that Congress affirms that STB is both capable and responsible for enforcement of the railroad's common carrier obligations. BLET appreciates the opportunity to testify here today. My written comments get into much more detail, including our opposition to so-called reciprocal switching. Congress and STB should take an interest in what PSR is doing to shippers, and because of the impact and the core impact to the shippers, what it's doing to the employees of these railroads. And this is where Congress can help give STB the legislative tools to ensure that America's freight railroads provide a world-class service. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
I thank the gentleman for his statement. We now turn to Brad Hildebrand, member of the National Industrial Transportation League and former vice president of Cargill Rail and Barge League. Mr. Hildebrand.
Good morning. Distinguished members of the House Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials Subcommittee, my name is Brad Hildebrand. I'm a member of NIT League and a recently retired vice president of Cargill Incorporated, where I worked for 39 years, spending the last 10 years leading Cargill's global rail and barge modes. I've also served on two different STB committees, the National Grain Car Council, where I was chair from 2013 to 15, and the Rail Energy Transportation Advisory Committee. I appreciate the opportunity of addressing NIT League's views on the reauthorization of the STB. As a member of NIT League, whose members include large and small rail shippers, we hope that Congress will give our recommendations thoughtful consideration. A lot has been said about precision scheduled railroading over the last 5 years. PSR is an operating methodology that has been championed by Wall Street to push railroads to improve their operating ratios and increase their bottom lines. I would be happy to take questions about PSR later. But simply put, the STB needs greater statutory authority to provide effective oversight of the freight rail industry. This is especially true in today's inflationary market. The implementation of PSR among nearly all Class 1 railroads has simply heightened the problem with the lack of railroad-to-railroad competition. A main statutory goal of the Staggers Act of 1980 is to instill competition. Today, we find ourselves in a highly consolidated rail industry with, at best, duopolistic railroad behaviors and expectations. NITLIG is pleased that the board is once again considering its reciprocal switching proposal. It has taken over 10 years to get to this point. NITLIG asks that 1, Congress encourage the board to reach a final reciprocal switching decision as expeditiously as possible, and 2, encourage additional avenues such as gateways for the board to consider that would facilitate railroad-to-railroad competition. Along with reciprocal switching, NITLIG would like to point out the issues with bringing rate cases before the board. Despite various provisions in the STB Authorization Act of 2015, rate cases are long, expensive, and risky for all shippers. It is encouraging that the board is considering its proposed final offer rate review. Unfortunately, no significant action has been taken to reduce the burden and cost of bringing a large rate case to the board. There are no current rate cases outstanding before the STB. None. This signals that the system is broken and needs attention. For those shippers that are brave enough to bring a rate case to the STB, they've experienced the board taking years to reach a decision while having to spend thousands, if not millions of dollars to conduct a case. I have personal experience where my former employer, Cargill, along with North American Freight Car Association, has a pending empty mileage case before the board that started 7 years ago. Shippers have become so discouraged that they have about given up bringing cases to the board. An area that we would like to see incorporated into the reauthorization is to provide statutory definition clarifying the common carry obligation. With no clear definition, the railroads are reducing service, demarketing lanes and commodities, and dictating terms and conditions that meet the railroad's goals. Adding more frustration is that the railroads do not incur any penalties when their service fails shippers. Having clarity around the definition of what it means to be a common carrier, combined with the STB developing a standard by which to measure common carrier service performance, should add accountability to the railroads to provide a level of service as required by statute. In addition, we ask Congress to increase the level of fines the board can assess when a railroad does not meet their common carry obligation. NITLIG asked Congress to consider removing commodity exemptions. We strongly believe that all movements falling to the board's jurisdiction should have the opportunity to seek redress and relief without having to go through the existing protracted process of seeking a revocation of the exemption. In conclusion, it takes a long time for the STB to issue a ruling. When they do issue a decision, NITLIG believes these decisions have gone in the railroad's favor. It is as the chickens need to convince the guard dog about what the fox is doing to them. All the while long, the fox does what foxes do when given the chance. Let me repeat that. The fox does what foxes do when given the chance. Thank you for your time and consideration of our recommendations.
I thank the gentleman for his statement. And with that, would move to our final witness, Herman Hackstein, President of Private Railcar Food and Beverage Association. Mr. Hackstein, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the subcommittee for holding this extremely important hearing. My name is Herman Hackstein. I am the president of the Private Railcar Food and Beverage Shippers Association. We call it PRFBA. My aim this morning is to shine some light on railroad performance, service, and financial burdens that are being felt by PRFBA members, and to strongly support the STB and its role, and perhaps more active role, in railroading today. PRFBA was formed in 2016. We have 18 global food and beverage companies that make up 100% of our membership. They are all major rail shippers, and uniquely, they all own rail assets. PRFBA members have rail cars and have invested millions of dollars in rail infrastructure. That uniquely makes them more committed to rail and less able to simply move to other modes of transport when things in railroading aren't going so well. If a decision was made to go to another mode, that means parking millions of dollars of assets, which is seldom a wise decision. However, given late service of late, Many of our members find themselves having to do that. PERFA members have skin in the game, and because of that, we deserve to be treated as such. The underlying issue, in our opinion, is competition. When there's a lack of competition, notably railroad to railroad competition, for those that need that clarified, and especially at single serve facilities or captive shippers, as they're called, the railroads are free to provide any service level at any cost. A good example of that was during the rollout of PSR and what the railroads did to their shippers. Where there's a lack of competition in a free market economy, it is incumbent upon the government, in this case through the Surface Transportation Board, per the Staggers Act, to intervene. PERFA members are not alone. Obviously, as the chairman pointed out when we started this morning, everybody has concerns today. But we don't need to look at concerns. We can look at the real facts that the railroads are not clearly presenting. And that is, the market is speaking. Unfortunately, freight is moving from rail to truck. And this is negatively impacting not only our supply chains, but our environment, our infrastructure. The results of a shipper survey published by Morgan Stanley just came out in January said 30 to 40% of shippers surveyed are moving some or a significant portion of their freight volume from rail to truck. Data published by the American Trucking Association indicates that from 2017, the beginning of PSR, to 2021 final results, truck tonnage grew by 3.5%, while rail tonnage shrunk by 5.1%. Interesting enough, even the AAR's own website publishes rail traffic information. Quick look at their website shows that since PSR in 2017, rail carload traffic in the United States has shrunk by 11%. Even if you add in intermodal, rail traffic overall in tonnage has still shrunk by 5%. Assuming that most of this traffic is moving to truck, as the data would suggest, and using a very conservative measure, which would be 3 trucks for every rail car, this migration is adding 4.5 million truckloads of shipments onto our highway every year. That additional volume is wearing out the infrastructure faster, it's creating unnecessary greenhouse gases, and it's impacting today's transportation capacity crunch. Our nation's rail advantage is hemorrhaging. The simple fact that rail volume is down and truck volumes are up illustrates that there's something wrong. That cannot be refuted. And the extra costs that our shippers are incurring because they're having to ship in other modes is a contributing factor of today's inflation. When there's a lack in the marketplace of competition and our railroad volumes are plummeting, it is incumbent upon the government, and in this case, the Surface Transportation Board, per the Staggers Act of 1980, to help us out. The railroads are financially strong. The Staggers Act in 1980 had 2 primary objectives: instill competition, stabilize the financial health of the railroads. They've certainly done the latter. We now need the help with the competition. Railroad financials are public information. I quickly called up the fourth quarter results at the end of 21, and it's amazing. And even in their financial results, they blatantly show all 7 Class 1 railroads had reduced volume in the fourth quarter of 21, and all 7 increased their revenue and increased their revenue per carload. They are shipping less and taking more. New authorization, PERFA supports a multi-year authorization at the highest levels for the Surface Transportation Board. We echo the concerns of the other folks, and we are thankful that you had this hearing. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank the gentleman. With that, we would now turn to questions. It seems like in listening to the panel, we have one panelist presenting the view that all is well. The STB does not need enhanced powers, and the rail industry is just doing wonderfully well. In fact, they did over the last 10 years on an inflation-adjusted basis buy back almost $200 billion worth of stock. So I guess from the perspective of Wall Street and CEOs whose salaries are tied to stock price and bonuses, everything's great. But all the other panelists are presenting a very disturbing view. I'd just like to know what the number one thing the STB could do succinctly from each of the panelists, and then if you can be succinct, then I'll ask Mr. Jeffries to respond. So quick, Mr. Jahn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Succinctly, reciprocal switching. So as I said in my testimony, right now we're in a situation where 3/4 of our members do not have a competitive option. And so providing that option would reduce rates significantly. But also note that there's something called the Rail Customer Coalition. That's 80 trade associations representing 9 million jobs and $5 trillion worth of economic activity in ag, in energy, and in manufacturing. And they all support taking that action.
Well, I guess I'll interrupt. I was hoping to move more quickly, but Mr. Jeffries' group has said force switching is intended to lead to rate reductions without a plausible explanation for non-speculative, competition-driven public benefits. These rate reductions are nothing more than a wealth transfer from the railroads to the shippers. In another, it says, force switching is not in the public interest, wealth transfer to more profitable entities. Anyone else want to put up their highest priority quickly?
If I may, PERFA would like to support, it is reciprocal switching. And we believe the ability for the STB to have enough power to be able to make these positive changes as quickly as possible. We absolutely 100% reciprocal switching. And for those who say it doesn't work, let's check with the 2 Class 1s that operate in Canada. It's worked fine there for many years.
Okay, we've got some substantial agreement here. Anyone on the panel have other than the freight railroads have a different view of the number one priority? Okay, what?
Yeah, Brad Hildebrand, Nittlich.
Yep.
One of the things that I think our members would like to see is the changing of the responsibility to prove guilt, if you will. Today, as I mentioned in my testimony, we have to prove to the STB as shippers that the railroad is doing something unreasonable to us. We would like that flipped around. Given the profitability and the viability of the railroads today, we think the railroads should be the ones that have to defend what they're doing in their rates as being reasonable and competitive versus us having to prove to the STB that they're unreasonable or uncompetitive.
Okay, thank you. Actually, that's done with other monopoly industries. For instance, utilities are regulated in that manner. Just one quick point. The 2 people have made the point about interswitching in Canada, and it works, but we hear it would be a disaster. Can Mr. Jahn or Mr. Hildebrand, can you just briefly comment on Canada's provisions?
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in there. I mean, Mr. Chairman, competition drives every single other segment of our economy. It drives innovation. It drives investment. We've seen that in Canada. As he's mentioned, those companies have increased their revenue and profits and improved their operational efficiency while doing interswitching. And they've said that publicly. The last thing I'll say is a study recently came out and said competitive rates in the United States are up 24% in the last 15 years. Non-competitive rates are up 230%. And so that's why we're looking for competitive switching.
Okay,
Mr.
thank
Chairman,
you.
may I comment on the
It's going to be real quick. I've only got a few seconds left. Go ahead.
Sure, I'd be glad to. So the Canadian rail system was built and designed with switching in mind, and the number of potential switches in Canada are remotely minuscule compared to the number of potential switches in the regime that the STB is proposing. Right now, switches can be ordered with a showing of anti-competitive conduct. That's the way it should be. It should not be a right to take one railroad's private property, give it to another for use at below market rates.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired. I turn now to Mr. Crawford for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to direct this question to Mr. Jeffries. We understand that the STB is reviewing a rule on reciprocal switching. How could reciprocal switching impact freight railroads' ability to transport goods and keep the supply chain moving?
So right now, again, the railroads enter into switches on a voluntary basis when it's planned out, when it's part of a strategic need. A shipper can also petition the STB for a switch when there's a demonstration of anti-competitive conduct. Adding switches adds complexity to the rail network. It undermines fluidity. It adds complications. It potentially, if it becomes a right versus a remedy to some sort of wrongdoing, it creates a disincentive to investment. If I have a plant and I know at any given time my competitor could be given access to that plant, that doesn't give me a lot of reason to make the long-term investments necessary. Forced switching would provide a remedy or a right to a handful of large shippers at the behest of them and at the cost of other customers and constituents across the entire rail network. That's why rail labor has opposed. Mr. Pierce and I probably aren't going to see eye to eye on a lot of things today. That's one area where we do have a common agreement, common understanding, and common policy view. The environmental crowd has opposed. Passenger rails have opposed. Right-leaning groups have opposed. Left-leaning groups have opposed. Intermodal associations have opposed. It's not just Class 1 railroads who see this as a bad idea. It's practically every user of the freight rail system, save a few large shipper groups out there. It just doesn't make sense for the overall vibrancy and health of the system. Again, a switch can be ordered if a railroad is demonstrated to be acting in an anti-competitive way, and that's the appropriate measure, not because a shipper wants a backdoor way to a rate cut.
One of the policy suggestions in the Biden administration's recent supply chain report is to encourage the STB to require railroads to provide additional rights of way to passenger rail. How would that impact freight movement and on the supply chain?
So let me start. I want to be clear. I completely agree that we can have a healthy freight rail network and a healthy passenger rail network. And that's done best when all sides sit down together, agree on the mutually agreed to outcome, agree the resources required, agrees who's going to apply those resources. We have win-win situations all over the country. But I have to say that including a recommendation that increasing the amount of passenger rail on the nation's freight railroads would somehow help alleviate supply chain problems is preposterous. And it really begs to question the work that went into this report. It's silly. It's silly. And that's not an anti-passenger rail statement. It's just preposterous to think that adding passenger trains somehow helps the overall supply chain.
I appreciate your comments. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back, and now I will give myself 5 minutes for questioning. Let's see. There are a number of groups that are an important part of this conversation and have sent in their own views on STB's reauthorization. I have 4 statements that I would like to enter into the record. First comes from the Brotherhood of Maintenance Way Employees Division, the Brotherhood of Railroad Signalmen, the International Association of Sheet Metal and Air Rail and Transportation Workers, Mechanical Division, and also the National Conference of Firemen and Oilers. The second comes from the Portland Cement Association. The third comes from the Freight Rail Customer Alliance. And the fourth comes from the Fertilizer Institute. I want to thank these groups for submitting statements for the record. Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Hildebrand, one of my top priorities as chairman of the subcommittee is to remove barriers in the rail sector. A complex and archaic rate challenge process is one of those barriers. Can you elaborate on how the SCB processes could provide a level playing field for all shippers?
One of the things that the STB is working on right now is final offer rate review, or what they call FOR. That's a streamlined approach to help improve the accessibility of small rate cases. And we would definitely like to see the board push that forward. Now, the certain 5 of the 7 class 1s have come up with their own arbitrary system to look at small rate cases. The board is also considering that. We believe that as a shipper, you should have the right to choose either FOR or whatever comes out of from the AAR in the final ruling. We should have the right to pick which way we want to go. But clearly that opens up an opportunity for us to bring what we call small rate cases to the board for them to rule on. We would definitely like them to rule faster, as I said in my testimony, than what they're ruling today. Clearly, it's taking way too long to get a decision. So I don't know if that's staffing or other issues that are slowing them down, but whatever we can do to streamline processes to help expedite cases to be heard and decided would be greatly appreciated by those of us that are in the shipping public.
Absolutely. And, you know, the technology exists now that some of these archaic systems should still not be in place. And I hope this is an opportunity to move forward in those areas. Mr. Pierce and Mr. Jahn, I have serious concerns about the effect of precision scheduled railroading, not only for the impacted workers, but also for the shippers that have that have to move their cargo. Running longer trains raises the possibility of safety concerns and could decrease the role of the rail in the nation's supply chain. Can you both explain how PSR has affected your work in the rail sector, and how do you think Congress should act in response? Mr. Pierce, let's begin with you.
Thank you, Chairman Payne. I think it's really simple to explain. Twice the train length, twice the amount of time to build that train, twice the amount of time to put that train away. If there's an unplanned emergency, twice the amount of time to walk that train. We're running trains in excess of 2 to 3 miles on any given day. And members, if they are forced to walk that train, are out there literally for hours on end, just walking to the rear of the train and walking back. Radio communications don't work that well that far. It has become a safety issue. At the same time, the railroad is literally shutting itself down by running trains do not fit their physical plant. We park shorter trains to run longer trains, and then we crews because the trains that have the other crews that are parked don't have enough time to get to their terminal. All of this impacts the shipping. All of it prevents the cars from getting to where they need to go. It's as though the railroads don't really care if those cars ever get there, is our viewpoint. And just one last thing, there is no suggestion box for the employees to tell the railroad what they think they could do better. It doesn't exist. I appreciate the opportunity to bring those issues here because we see it every day, what could be done more efficiently that is not happening right now.
Thank you. Mr. Jahn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What we say about precision scheduled railroading is that it's doing less with less. Our experience there is that rates go up and velocity goes down. So just to give you one example, we've got a member company, it's got multiple facilities in the Southeast. At one plant, they've lost 110 million pounds of production in 14 months. Another site has lost 5.5 million pounds of production over 6 months. These are lost sales, not only for our members and exacerbate the inflation and the supply chain challenges we have, but they're also lost sales for the railroad. I think that's really important. We can't ship what we can't make. And that's what's worse is we have no recourse under the current system. So I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Chairman DeFazio as well. I know you've requested a GAO report on precision scheduled railroading, and we look forward to the results of that report. Thank you.
Thank you, as we do as well. Mr. Newman, as Railroad Subcommittee and longtime passenger rail, I want to ensure that the American people feel the full benefits of the historic funding to IIJA invest in our rail work. Doing so requires cooperation from all partners since so much of the freight and intercity passenger rail systems overlap. Can you describe the significance of the proceeding pending before you, the STB, to restore Amtrak's Gulf Coast service? Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
And we would ask you to submit that for the record because my time has expired. Next, we will have Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Great to see the witnesses, albeit I can't wait till we get a time when we're here in the same room again, running hearings like we used to have prior to the pandemic. My first question is actually for Mr. Jeffries and Mr. Jahn. The railroads talk about rates decreasing more than 40% since the Staggers Act. However, Mr. Jahn has testified that rates have increased 30% in the past 20 years. Now, obviously, this seems contradictory. My question to both Mr. Jeffries and Mr. Jahn is about rates. Have they been increasing or decreasing? And do you predict rates will increase or decrease in the coming years? Mr. Jeffries, go ahead.
Well, thank you for the question. And I could not agree more. I wish we were doing this hearing in person and look forward to the opportunity to do that soon. So when you think about rates, since 1980, rail rates are down 40%, 44% to be exact. The number Mr. Jahn used, I think, is from 2002, 2004, something along those lines. It says rail rates are up 30%. And in my opening statement, I acquiesced that rates have increased in recent years. We are back to the levels that rates were in 1990, 32 years ago. And folks talk about the year 2017. Somebody mentioned that, I think, is this onset of PSR. Since December 2016 through December 2021, rail rates have increased roughly 20% writ large. It's about half that of long haul trucking, and quite frankly, half that of many of the industries represented today. So yes, rates are back to where they were in 1990.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jeffries. Mr. Jahn?
Thank you, Congressman. So rail rates did fall significantly in the 80s and 90s. However, that's long since reversed. Again, as Ian said, since 2001, rail rates have risen twice as fast as both long haul trucking and inflation. I think the most important thing here, though, is what we're talking about. And I want to be really clear about this. On competitive routes, rates have gone up relatively little over a relatively long amount of time, 24% over the past 15 years. In non-competitive situations, captive shippers, 3/4 of our member companies are captive. Those rates have gone up 230% over that same time. So it's really important to understand when we're talking about rates overall versus competitive and non-competitive rates. And so what's happened is after massive consolidation in the industry, railroads have leveraged their market power to extract higher prices and shift costs to their customers.
All right, thank you, Mr.
One
Jahn.
quick point on that, Congressman Davis, I think it's important to note that no shipper went from 2 to 1 railroad as the result of a merger at any point. And so this is thrown around a lot, but due to merger conditions, no one ever lost access to a second shipper because of a merger.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. I got another question for both of you. If you could answer real quick, because I need some time to address an Amtrak issue that I ask about every time that I have somebody from Amtrak on at a hearing. But Ian and Chris, most shippers have said that they support reciprocal switching, but AAR has said it will slow operations and harm shippers. Mr. Jahn, why would shippers really quickly, why would they support something that will harm them?
We wouldn't support something that will harm them. In fact, again, a similar system has worked in Canada for decades. Secondly, we have our own financial interest for the system to work quickly and smoothly. And so we're not looking for something to gum up the works. And third, the STB ultimately has the control of this process. They don't have to approve that application. They have the opportunity to deny it if we apply for it.
All right, Mr. Jeffries, would you like to explain from your point of view why shippers will be harmed?
Sure, absolutely, because it undermines fluidity, disincentivizes investments, and opens up one private company's network for use by another at the behest of a shipper. I would say that there are large shippers that are pushing for this and might benefit in the short term, but the stakeholder group of concern is much, much broader than that, including UPS filed in 2016 in opposition, rail laborers filed in opposition, intermodal associations filed in opposition, environmental groups, passenger rails filed in opposition. So the list goes on and on and on. And again, the board can act on a reciprocal switch request right now, but there has to be a demonstration of anti-competitive conduct, and we think that's the appropriate hurdle. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jeffries. I don't need a response for this from Mr. Newman or Mr. Jeffries, but once again, the Amtrak line from Chicago through Champaign, Illinois, down to Carbondale has the worst on-time performance. We've been dealing with the short shunt issue with CN and Amtrak. I've been told numerous times in hearings here by both Amtrak and the rail industry that we've got a solution, we're working it out. Still, I don't have an update as to when this is going to be completed, what technology is going to be utilized, and when can we begin to see progress. I certainly hope that I can get together with both of you in the future to figure this out, because I don't want to go through another hearing where we still don't have answers. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Let's hear from the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to our guests and witnesses. Mr. Jeffries, it's good to see you again. I want to zoom out with you a little bit, no pun intended, and talk about capitalism. I'm a capitalist. I think it's safe to assume that you are as well. Like you, I think that balanced regulation is the goal that we should be striving for here. And I recognize, and as part of that discussion, that our Class 1 railroads are not nonprofits. You're in the business of succeeding financially, and I want you to succeed financially. But to me, responsible capitalists do certain things. They serve their investors, obviously, and your member companies have clearly been doing a very good job serving their investors in the last few years. But responsible customers also serve their customers. They serve their employees. They treat them well. They treat them with respect. That's how you run a good, sustainable business. And based on what we've heard here today from your customers, from your employees, I think some of your companies are falling short here. And that's unfortunate because it gives this system of capitalism that we all support a bad name. Let me raise a couple of specific issues. Employees and employment. Before the hearing, I looked at some of the transcripts of the fourth quarter earning calls from some of your companies. And what they're all telling Wall Street right now is that they don't have the workers they need, and that this is causing operational challenges. It's causing some of the supply chain difficulties that we're all experiencing in the economy. So I want to ask you, you think that might have something to do with the fact that between 2015 and 2019, the Class 1 railroads, as part of this unyielding maximalist pursuit of efficiency, eliminated 29,000 jobs, 17% of their workforce?
So you're absolutely right that workforces were down going into the pandemic. If you look at rail service metrics, they were actually pretty strong going into the pandemic. But certainly the pandemic created an economic shock that no one saw coming. Additional layoffs were necessary due to the 30% decrease in rail traffic. Fortunately, demand has come back, came roaring back. And that's why railroads have been hiring across all crafts for the past 12 months. And are we where we want to be? No, hiring continues. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find an industry that isn't having challenges bringing people on board.
Well, it's certainly true. But I think, again, one of the arguments that we might have had in that period before the pandemic is that you need some slack in the system, that you don't want to cut down to the bare bones on the basis of a sort of an efficiency first philosophy, because you can predict the pandemic, but anyone can predict that there will be crises. There will be crises in the future that we can't predict. So, I mean, wasn't that a mistake in effect from a forward planning, long-term thinking point of view?
So I don't want to, different railroads were in different places during that time frame. And so I can't speak for each individual railroad's decisions on what the appropriate employment base was for that railroad, for its network. But I can tell you, regardless of their requisite employee bases, everyone went through challenges and has gone through challenges over the past 3 years, as has every industry. And the important thing is that all railroads are actively hiring where appropriate, where regions where they need to bring on more employees. And they're taking additional steps, signing bonuses and the like to make these careers attractive, because we do need the next generation of railroaders. We're a fully collectively bargained industry, as you know. Wages and benefits are roughly $135,000, $700 per employee on average. So these are good jobs, but it's also not a job that you can just hire somebody and they're on the street the next day. These are very skilled types of
Exactly,
jobs.
which is why I think probably laying off that many skilled workers in the name of efficiency was a mistake. With the time I've left, if I could just ask you to address the stock buyback issue as well. I mean, the class ones have spent about $150 billion on rail infrastructure since 2010. That's fantastic. But in that same period, nearly $200 billion in stock buybacks. Like,
So
explain that aspect of capitalism to us, because it doesn't make sense for my maybe old-fashioned view of how capitalism should work.
So respectfully, I can't comment on individual investor decisions or investment decisions, but what I can say is that our industry, despite what you've said, continues to invest 18% of revenues back into their capital plant, which far exceeds most of our peer industries.
Well, thank you. I mean, we're making enormous public investments as well in infrastructure that you are using. And when we see numbers like that, it does give me pause. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentleman. Years back. Now we'll hear from Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. My questions are going to be for Chris Jahn. Loaded question, I guess, Chris. All the interruptions in supply chain across the country. Of course, as you know, Texas is huge on energy and other things. We produce a lot of chemicals. How have your members been affected by that interruption?
We've been significantly impacted, and it's been a significant challenge. Earlier I had detailed an example where we've had one member in just one instance in the past year has lost over 110 million pounds of production at one plant, and there was 6 million pounds of production at another plant. It's not only costs them sales, but also costs the railroad sales, because we can't sell what we can't ship.
Right. So now I guess the question is, are there any potential shipper concerns with Amtrak's apparent intent to expand its services on freight lines across the national network? I know you've had that discussion. I've had to be off line for a minute and back online for a minute. So forgive me if it's redundant. Any concerns about that, Chris?
So anything that stresses what's already an overstressed rail network is a concern for us. And so the rail network has had challenges over the past few years. COVID has made even a more significant challenge. Putting another challenge on top of that seems to us to be a poor strategy.
What would you say is the percentage that the interruption in supply chains has impacted y'all across the country, I'm sure, but all of your, the people pertain or chemical council folks?
Yeah, so it really depends. Yeah, Congressman, it depends on where you are. So some railroads have performed better than others in terms of their performance. And so, again, I've highlighted some places in the Southeast where we've had particular problems. I would not say that there's anywhere, though, that is up to snuff.
I'm sorry. Thank you for that. So what is your response to concerns voiced by the freight railroads to reciprocal switching rule?
So again, we've got two things, I guess I would say. One, and something I've not said yet before, is reciprocal switching was expressly contemplated by Congress in the Staggers Act. This is not something that's new. And under the Staggers Act, it calls for competition among rail carriers to the extent possible. We're not getting that. So what we need then is reasonable rates when competition doesn't exist. And so what we're trying to do is create further competition. And so that's not something new. That's not something that's We haven't tried in Canada already. We've talked about that previously. That has worked effectively there. And the system works, and now railroads have grown. And finally, it's an opportunity for the railroads themselves to get more traffic and more of our work. We want to give them more business if they're more competitive.
I see if I can get myself unmuted here. Well, thank you for that. And then finally, recommendations you might have for any potential STB reauthorization.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things we'd look at to make sure that the STB has enough staff and enough financial resources to give them the ability to do a better job on collecting data. Those are the couple of things I would point to.
Okay, well, with that, I'm done my questions. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to get into the record American Fuel Patrol and Petrochemical Manufacturers a letter dated March 8th, 2022 to you, Mr. Chairman, and the rest of the group that says RE stakeholder views on Surface Transportation Board reauthorization. Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, I'm sorry.
Thank you. That's right. Thank you. I yield back.
And 8 other conversations going on behind me. Okay. We'll next have Mr. Moulton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin with Mr. Newman. Mr. Newman, you have an impressive background, and wanted to ask you a question about passenger rail that actually extends a little bit beyond Amtrak. The STB, of course, has authority beyond Amtrak as written into the law. For example, the STB has ruled that Texas Central, the high-speed rail project between Dallas and Houston, with which Amtrak has a ticketing agreement, will qualify as part of the interstate rail network and fall under STB jurisdiction. Can you tell me what role can STB reauthorization play in supporting private high-speed rail projects like Texas Central and Brightline West?
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman Moulton. From Amtrak's standpoint, we are very much interested in being able to see improvements and increases in intercity passenger rail in whatever provider might be able to be providing that service. So to the extent that there is a need, or recourse to the STB to encourage the growth of intercity passenger rail for other operators, we think that would be appropriate.
Mr. Jeffries, over to you. Thank you very much for your thoughtful response to my questions for the record after our full committee's hearing on North American supply chain issues last November. You probably recall that I asked how to shift more freight from highway to rail, which I think many people on the committee have acknowledged would be good for congestion, good for the environment, good for efficiency if it's done well. Do you agree that regulation of the freight rail industry by the STB should not inhibit and in fact should perhaps bolster this goal of shifting more traffic to rail?
I could not agree more with that statement. Absolutely. Intermodal traffic is over half rail traffic right now. That's going to continue to grow. It should continue to grow. When you look at the consumer demand we're seeing in this country, last year, over the first 6 months of 2021, freight rail moved more intermodal units than they had at any 6-month period in their history. But we want to take on more because we think it's good for the environment, it's good for congestion, it's good for highway degradation, and quite frankly, a good public policy goal. So absolutely.
So you've also noted in your response that capacity is key, and there are capacity constraints on the railroads today. I have to say that when you see these numbers that you've invested $150 billion in capacity infrastructure improvements, but as Mr. Malinowski pointed out, $200 billion in stock buybacks, that doesn't make us feel like that you're striking that balance right. Because if we could be, if you put that $200 billion into capacity, think about how much more we could have. How do you think about prioritizing that balance?
So when you're making an investment into the rail network, you're making a 50-year, if not 100-year investment. And so you need to invest not only for the demand today, but of course, keep making those long-term investments. I can't comment on investor relations decisions, but what I can say is that sustained level of investment that freight rail has been able to put back into its networks has resulted in an infrastructure that's the highest rated by the American Society of Civil Engineers. It's an investment level that far exceeds most other industries in the U.S., with 18% of revenues going back into the capital plant.
No,
And
Ms. Jeffries, I appreciate those numbers, and if you shared them before. I'm just trying to make the point here that, you know, you may not be able to comment on investor decisions as you frame it. But those investor decisions or investor relationship decisions affect your relationships with your customers too, when you can't deliver the service that you could if you were able to put more into the infrastructure. I'm impressed with freight rail infrastructure. My point is that I think it could be better. And I want to make sure that the STB finds its role in helping to incentivize that, because I want to see you grow your business even further. And while there's a tremendous focus on efficiency, I do share the concern of many members of this committee that we're not focused enough on growth, and I'm not quite sure how we get there. You know, one of the things that you also said is that when we're talking about precision scheduled railroading is that, you know, it doesn't have a one size fits all meeting. And obviously, if you're improving efficiency, if you're getting cars to their destination with less switching, you know, more direct routes, that's all good. But when we hear from shippers, as we have this morning on the committee, that there are others who are not, you know, who are getting the service that they need, they're actually seeing their service go down. I wonder whether we're really finding the right definition for precision scheduled railroading here. If it's not really helping grow the business, it's just making what we have more efficient. Is that really the ultimate goal?
well, I think service is absolutely a top line goal. Safety is the top line goal. Service is a top line goal. And we need to serve our entire customer network and look to do that every day. Now, are there areas where there are challenges? Absolutely. And I would probably ascertain that every industry is facing challenges in certain parts of its network right now. But
Thank you.
at the end of the day, we've got to try to serve all the customers we can, and growth is absolutely a key priority.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next, we will have the distinguished gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burkett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate Ranking Member Dusty Johnson, the pride of T.F. Riggs High School. I believe he was the captain of the debate team and the wrestling team. Quite a combination, quite a combination. Mr. Jeffries, my district in East Tennessee is served by the Knoxville and Holston River Railroad, and that's a short line railroad that connects both the CSX and Norfolk Southern. Can you talk about how forthcoming STB regulations might impact short line railroads?
Sure, absolutely. I would also say, remind me never to get involved with a guy who's a wrestler and a debate champ. But
He'll talk you to death while he's beating your head in the ground.
right, exactly. But more importantly, to your question, I can tell you that the short line railroad industry has filed in opposition and will be testifying in opposition of the reciprocal switching proposal that's pending before the STB. 90% of issues short lines and class ones are aligned on. Certainly there are areas where one's perhaps more important to the other. But when it comes to STB issues, by and large, the short lines see eye to eye with the class ones on some of the larger re-regulatory efforts that have been proposed or could be considered over at the board.
Okay, thank you. Some of the witness today suggested that the STB's reciprocal switching rule could actually increase competition within the rail industry and lower shipping costs. What do you make of that? Is that accurate or inaccurate?
I'd say it's wholly inaccurate. The push for forced access, reciprocal switching, whatever you want to call it, is simply forcing one railroad to open up its network at the behest of a shipper. And that's not competition. That's just a wealth transfer, government directed wealth transfer, and it doesn't make sense.
All right. Mr. Newman, what do you think the difference is between state-supported and long-distance service is?
I'm sorry, Congressman, could you, the difference between state-supported and long distance in what dimension?
I assume in reference to
I didn't
Amtrak.
quite hear the question. Sorry, so the question was, what's the difference between state-supported and long distance?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, oh, okay. Our, yes, so the over routes that are over 750 miles are our long distance services. Those under 750 miles are the ones that we operate as state supported service, and we therefore contract and arrange with a state or a set of states for the operation of the service.
Okay. Well, is Amtrak, are y'all planning on expanding the rail service? I know you are in 20 states, is that correct? Over the next 15 years, is that what I read?
Well, we actually look, we currently serve 46 states. We look to our vision for expanding passenger rail, which we introduced last year, Amtrak Connects Us, looked to identify a number of corridors which we think are good opportunities for the expansion of intercity passenger rail. There were roughly 20 new corridors laid out there. So there's that number 20, as well as increased service, 29, increased service on another 34 existing corridors.
Okay, I guess what I'm getting at is the, when you all expand in these states, and I know you're looking for funding by the states, are you gonna ask for a decrease in appropriations for Amtrak to match that, or will it be on top of that?
No, we would not be looking for a decrease in appropriations. Under IIJA, we have got now that provides funding for expansion, for the capital that's needed for expanding our network. And although we do contract with states and states do provide support for our state supported services, our annual appropriations are still needed for to fund our ongoing operations, both of our long distance and state supported service and our Northeast corridor.
Do you ever see in the future at any time that Amtrak will actually cash flow?
Well,
A simple yes
actual,
or no.
I think in the near future, it's no, and it's very difficult to say. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back none of my time.
Thank you, the gentleman from Tennessee. Now we will have Mr. Auchincloss for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. Opportunity to discuss tangible ways can facilitate the even chain issues that are consumer businesses and companies in the Massachusetts Fourth. Those issues in the Massachusetts Fourth are represented in today's panel, with more than 350 jobs in my district making up a portion of the American Chemistry Council. Mr. Jeffries, I'd like to begin with a few questions for you, and really at about the intersection between rail and the ports. We're all familiar with the challenge with port congestion and how that congestion can ripple through the ports onto the rail system. What has been the biggest cause of congestion in containers onto railroads, and how can the STB help address that?
Thank you, Congressman. You either on my end or your end, you broke up a little bit at the end of the question. So I believe the question was about congestion at the ports and supply chains and what can be done to help address that.
I apologize. Yeah, what has been the biggest cause of congestion in moving containers onto railroads, and how can the STB help address that?
Sure, absolutely. So I would say there's maybe not one cause. The supply chain challenges kind of run the gamut throughout the entire integrated supply chain, going from whether it's factory and in Asia to the ocean carrier waiting off the coast to be able to be unloaded. transloaded to rail and so forth. So I think, we're seeing a number of different issues, some of it at the port, some of it at the rail yard, although we've been able to work through a decent amount of it. And a lot of that's well documented. It's lack of short haul truckers, it's lack of chassis. It was, and depending on where you are, still is a breakdown of hours available to work. Railroads operate 24/7, always have, continue to, always will. Not every aspect of the supply chain works 24/7. We did see the news over the fall that the ports of LA Long Beach did expand. But we need a supply chain that's functioning at full throttle across the board. Warehouse space continues to be a major challenge. You've got to have a place to take containers once they get onto the rail. Once they get to the yard, you've got to have truckers to pick them up. You've got to have chassis for the container to go on. You've got to have a warehouse to take it to. And
so, Mr. Jeffries, in particular, can you just talk about what you think the STB could do in these, for any of these specific issues that you're raising?
Sure. I think, the STB and the administration writ large is taking the appropriate approach of getting people in the room together and talking about what are solutions that interested parties can take, because most of this is private to private to private. And so there's been some success there, and
yes,
that stakeholder engagement has been completely appropriate, in my opinion.
What's your view on dock rail, and what role do you think it can play in lessening future port congestion?
I think it can play a very productive role, and certainly some of the port infrastructure programs that have come out of the infrastructure bill provide opportunities for additional build out. Of course, most of the ports are public or public-private partnerships, but when you're able to build out on dock rail onto a spur, you can immediately put that onto train versus going from ship to truck to train. You can take it inland into an intermodal yard where it can be transferred and get rid of some of that gridlock and traffic at the port itself. And frankly, it means more containers are going on train versus going on truck. And we think that's a good public policy goal. It's more business for the railroads. It's more jobs for Mr. Pierce's employees and our employees. And it's good for environment, good for degradation, good for environmental justice, good for any number of things.
On this point about environmental efforts, can you expand more on how you're working to modernize freight rail with electric and hydrogen powered locomotives? And maybe just take 15 seconds or 30 seconds, because I want to close the question for Mr. Hildebrand.
Absolutely. Great question. So railroads are exploring battery electric, hydrogen power, increased use of biofuels. You've seen reports of revenue service activities going on across different railroads. One railroad just bought 20 battery electric locomotives to use in switching. I'll say the infrastructure bill includes a number of programs coming out of DOE that'll provide funds for R&D into furthering those objectives and those goals. It's going to be a long-term process, not overnight, but something we're all excited about, and it's going to be necessary in order to reduce our emissions goals.
And Mr. Jeffries, would you be willing to follow up on the record with some more about what you're doing as an industry on that front?
Absolutely. I'd be more than
15
happy.
seconds.
All right, final question, Mr. Hildebrand. Is your organization updating your members about funding opportunities, including in the bipartisan infrastructure law for grade crossing improvement programs? And if not, will you?
I can't speak to that. I'm sorry.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Yield back.
Now we'll hear from Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let's start with Mr. Jeffries. Mr. Hildebrand, in his testimony, raised the issue that some commodities are exempt from a number of the STB provisions. He suggests there could be every 5 years a review of those exemptions. What are your thoughts? Is that workable?
Well, I would say there needs to be a demonstrated need for it, and right now, an entity can apply to have its commodity exemption revoked or removed, and so that strikes me as the appropriate process for that. Exemptions are there for a reason, because there's a significant level of competition between modes, and unless proven otherwise, it doesn't make a lot of sense, in my opinion, at least, to to just revoke those without cause.
So, and you just alluded to this, but just from an educational perspective, was the rationale, because I think it was in the Staggers Act that these exemptions were allowed, is it that there is a high level of intermodal competition with this fresh dairy and fresh meat, those sorts of ag products?
Right, it's competition based.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so how about for Mr. Hildebrand? Mr. Jeffries, in his testimony, suggested that new regulations by the STB could be subject to a cost-benefit analysis, as is the case with a number of other federal agencies. Mr. Hildebrand, any reaction to that?
Yeah, so, well, in principle, whatever happens should make reasonable cost benefit analysis and should clear a certain hurdle. So, on a surface, not a big issue, but I think this is just the AAR trying to delay and or prolong some of the things that the board's trying to get accomplished. And if I may, real quick about reciprocal switching. This isn't new in the United States, folks. This has been going on for many, many years. We're
Mr.
using
Hildebrand,
it today.
I'm sorry,
It's working.
I got to cut you off because I think reciprocal switching, we've talked a lot about that today. I want to get to some of the areas that haven't been uncovered yet. I will give you an opportunity, Mr. Hildebrand, if you wanted to add anything more to what Mr. Jeffries said about your suggestion of doing the commodity exemption review every 5 years. He suggested it was unnecessary.
We think it's very important that a path forward that's much easier than what's involved today to open up and remove exemptions is necessary. I mean, what do you have to lose if you're trying to compete for business today? What are they hiding from? What are they afraid of? This should be a process that is allowed by the board to bring things for the removal of an exemption.
A number of the witnesses talked a fair amount about the final offer rate review pending or the rule promulgation by the STB. I don't know that we've had as much discussion, anywhere near as much discussion on the voluntary arbitration process, rule promulgation. And so maybe we'll start with Mr. Jeffries and then go to Mr. Hildebrand, and then it can be an all play with the time we have left. What do y'all's organizations think about that pending rule?
So I think it's widely noted that several Class 1 railroads proposed a paradigm for an alternative dispute resolution program through voluntary arbitration for smaller rate cases, recognizing that the rate case process is less accessible for some smaller shippers. And we are encouraged that the board reacted to that and has put out a potential proposal that takes a lot of those ideas. I think the important thing is, and this aligns with STB Chairman Oberman's goals, is it allows private parties to work out disputes and work out situations. Our challenge with the FORR proposal is that the STB is absolving itself of determining what the maximum reasonable rate is. It's either picking the rail suggestion or the shipper suggestion, and quite frankly, usurps its own statutory authority, and it doesn't have statutory authority to be a baseball-style arbitrator. So we think voluntary arbitration is appropriate. We're willing to make commitments. We're staying in the program.
Mr. Jeffries, I got to cut you off because I do think that the FORR has been pretty well covered. Mr. Hildebrand, your thoughts on the voluntary arbitration process?
Yeah, so the problem with that one is that they want to keep it confidential. So if you file one of these cases under this provision, it will never see the light of day. So we'll never see how many of these things are out there, what's the decision, what's the rationale. They want to keep this confidential. That's why we object to it.
So you don't think that would be helpful to small shippers? And that's sort of the value proposition.
It will not be helpful because I don't think we'll use it. Why would we use it if we don't know anything about what's happened before, what kind of decisions were rendered? People are not going to use it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now I have the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me say thank you to the railroad industry for your help in trying to get the supply chain problems in line. And you've been on the front lines yourselves throughout this pandemic, and we appreciate that. And you have done it while causing much less pollution than some of the our trucking friends. So thank you to the railroads for that. I have a question for Mr. Newman and Mr. Pierce. Mr. Newman, you mentioned in your testimony that current statutory provisions governing the STB's review of mergers is essentially rubber stamped. And since 1980s, we've gone from 33 railroads to 7, may soon be 6. So I would ask you how that process works, how those mergers have affected passengers. And then, Mr. Pierce, as we push for more profit for the railroads from Wall Street, how have these mergers affected our railroad workers? And what can we do as we look to revise or reestablish or reauthorize this agency to protect those workers?
Well, I thank you for the question, Congresswoman Titus. And we have seen in the past situations where mergers have caused increased traffic and therefore delays. I mean, in some cases in the past that there have been, really were meltdowns as a result of the mergers that really took quite a while for our passenger traffic to recover from those delays. So that, our concern is that the STB have the ability to take the public interest into account and ensure that the public interest standard is a component of the STB's review, as well as that the STB have the ability to make directives to ensure that passenger rail is able to operate successfully in the wake of mergers.
Thank you, Mr. Pierce.
Thank you. I think if you look back at the history of the big merger push of the late 90s, there were multiple meltdowns, a lot of missteps in trying to integrate workforces, integrate what were once competing railroads into a single unit. With the two primary ones on the landscape coming forward with the CPKCS and the CSX acquisition of Pan Am, we've been very involved with the STB about trying to make sure that the protective conditions that the STB has the right to impose are included in any decisions to make sure that the workers get a fair shake when it comes to how these railroads are merged into a single entity.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because it's not all just about profit, it's about safety as well. And speaking of safety, what about this tendency to put together small trains into one long train that's carrying mixed cargo? If there's a derailment or an accident, the exposure to the environment and to the people living nearby, as well as the people on the train. I don't know, Mr. Jeffries, you want to address that?
Sure. So I think when you look at train length versus incident, there's not been any correlation there. Most incidents, leading cause of incidents is either human factors, track cause incidents. 2021, we had the lowest number of track cause incidents in the history of the industry. But I think it's important to note that, again, when train lengths are massively vary in length, and over 90% of trains operating on any given day are under 7,500 feet long. Are there some that are longer? Absolutely, but railroads have the infrastructure, design the infrastructure in order to meet the needs of a train length, whatever that might be.
Do you think it would make a difference in the length of train for the number of people who are working on that train?
Well, Congresswoman, as you know, I think you're referring to efforts to mandate 2 people physically located in the cab of a locomotive at all times. We're vociferously opposed to that. We don't think it makes sense from a safety standpoint. We propose potential alternative models where you have crew also stationed outside of the train along the right of way. Should there be an unplanned event, that crew person is there with the tools necessary in order to investigate it. Also working a planned schedule, predictable hours. My point being, I don't think it makes sense to mandate any sort of current operating paradigm in perpetuity into the future, because you never know what is going to evolve over time in order to allow for innovation, competitiveness, and related. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pierce. You want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, We adamantly
Oh.
disagree with Mr. Jeffries on the safety aspects of two-person crews. The extra set of eyes and ears in the cab of a locomotive is essential to a safe railroad operation. And there's no data that shows that assigning those employees on the ground is going to come with an equal level of safety.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Nelms for 5 minutes. Mr. Nelms?
Sheriff, we can't hear you.
We'll go to Mr. Balderson.
Good morning, still morning. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you all for being here. My first question is for Ian Jeffries. Mr. Jeffries, thank you. In your testimony, you note to remain competitive, railroads must earn sufficient revenues to continually make significant investments in infrastructure, equipment, training, and technologies. And that if railroads are unable to make such infrastructure investments, there could be a cascading impact on the health of the rail network. Can you expand on the unintended consequences that forced switching could have on the infrastructure investments your members make every year?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you. As this committee well knows, freight rail uses almost entirely its own funds to invest in, grow, and maintain its capital network. And when you have a potential switching regime that would require one railroad to open up its private assets to another at the behest of a shipper, it can result in a disincentive to maintain that network. If you can't get a return on investment that supports continued investment. And that's not good for the rail network writ large. It's not good for most rail shippers. And quite frankly, it's not good for the highways. It's not good for the environment. It's not good for passenger rail. And so our longstanding point is, and will continue to be, that we need a system that allows us to earn adequate revenues to invest back into the network. We've got to grow. Growth is absolutely key in order to meet the freight movement needs of this country today and into the future. And the STB has backstops in place. It has rate dispute adjudication processes. It has service remedy options. Can they be improved? Perhaps. We've offered ways to streamline these processes. I know shippers have as well. But let's improve what tools are there versus continuing to add additional tools, ill thought out tools that will result in undermining the fluidity and health of the freight rail network.
Thank you for that. My next question is for Mr. Jahn, and I understand you and your members have different opinions on this issue than Mr. Jeffries and his members. But as rail customers and users, do you share any concerns that the proposed changes to reciprocate switching could impact future rail investments in their infrastructure or technology?
No. Short answer is no. So look, competition drives investment in every sector of the economy. And that would be true here as well. A railroad would have the incentive to earn its business going forward and would have to invest and innovate, as our members do, in a globally competitive market. And so we would be looking for the same thing to happen here with this reciprocal switching proposal that has been pending for years at the STB and already works effectively in Canada.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my remaining time. Thank you, both of you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Next, we have the gentlelady from California, Ms. Napolitano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Newman, we were just recently notified that Amtrak will continue to operate several long-distance routes at reduced frequency through at least May and likely into a peak summer season. We are told that Amtrak has insufficient staff and cannot operate 7-day service as required by the American Rescue Plan Act. As Omicron recedes and the nation begins to travel substantially more in the summer, Amtrak needs to fully restore its most popular summer route 7-day service What's holding Amtrak back? And what are they doing to restore the service, full service as soon as possible? What methodology of recruitment are you using to bring back your laid-off employees and recruit new employees?
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman Napolitano. And we are very much interested in getting our service back to full frequency as quickly as possible, as you stated, and of course with to be able to operate safely. As you stated, we are at the moment challenged for staff. And we have really kicked up our recruiting efforts. We have actually long ago recalled all employees who were laid off. So that's not our issue. But we have more than doubled the amount of our staff in talent acquisition. We have got stepped up efforts in recruiting at trade fairs, at trade schools. We have got referral incentives for employees to refer other employees so that we can get more folks on staff. We have got, as well as bringing in more people, we're also working on retention. So we have got incentives to keep employees from retiring and stay with us. So, while we would like to get that service restored, we definitely do want to get that service restored as quickly as possible.
How soon do you think it will be?
It will take a bit of time.
How soon do you
Excuse
think
me?
you'll restore the service?
I think we'll have better visibility here in the next month or two. As we are, as much as we're hiring, we also have got to get people through training, get equipment that needs to be checked. So,
Well, then would you mind letting some of us know so we can get the word out that you are recruiting?
yes. Thank you. We can actually give you some good information on what we are up to, and we will keep you informed as we move forward.
Thank you very much. The next question will be for everybody. I've heard from businesses in my district that many that have been long customers of the railroad. My constituent businesses have said railroad service has become less reliable and less efficient. The businesses contend the railroads don't provide on-time delivery and effective schedules they were used to for many years. The business also mentioned that when they have customer complaints, railroads don't have enough customer service staff than they used to have to answer the questions. My question for all witnesses, why is this happening?
If I can answer the question, this is Herman Hackstein from the Private Railcar Food and Beverage Shippers Association. I believe it is happening because the railroads have reduced their workforce and reduced their resources by so much that they're simply unable to keep up with the current demand. And what your constituents are telling you is clearly evident in all the other facts, which is freight is moving from the rail to truck because the railroads can't service their customers.
Yeah, Mr.
It's
Jeffries,
simply,
then. Thank you very much. I'm running short of time, but Mr. Jeffries, I understand from a report that you have less employees than and you have more cargo than many years prior. Why haven't you been able to uptick your labor force?
Well, certainly the past 2 years have been a challenge. We've been actively hiring across all crafts throughout the railroads and regionally where appropriate, and continue to do that. And we'll continue to work until we have the workforce that we feel is appropriate to meet demand out there. Talent is there's fierce competition for good talent out there, and our workforce is highly skilled, highly trained, and we need folks that are up for the task and are willing and able to put in the time necessary, because it is an industry that requires a high level of dedication, skill, and commitment. And we're proud of the employees that we have, and we're always looking for more, especially today.
Well, Mr. Jeffries, same thing I told Mr. Newman. If you let us know that you have openings, we might be able to get you some recruits. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. We'll now have Mr. Stauber for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you all for coming today to speak a little bit about your industries and about how the STB reauthorization should look. As you all know, we are in a state of crisis when it comes to our supply chains and inflation. Each is tied to the other in many ways. So there's no reason that families should be stressed about how to feed their families as the cost of groceries continues to skyrocket and we are met with bare shelves at the store. The shippers, the rail industry, and our union workforce is working to keep food on the table and get products across the country in a timely fashion. We know that the rail industry is one of the most efficient parts of our supply chain. However, we also know that government regulation and overreach has made this job harder. Whether this falls within the STB reauthorization or not, and this question is for anyone, what could we do tomorrow to alleviate some of your biggest government-related stressors that make your jobs more difficult? Any of the panelists?
I'll take a first crack on that. I think it's all about modernizing the regulatory structure. And that, as I say that might mean something to Mr. Jahn than it does to me when it comes to the STB. But, operationally, we need to promote innovation. We need to promote technological deployment. That's going to result in more efficiency. That's going to result in a higher level of safety. It's not anti-worker. It's evolving the way that the business operates in an appropriate way that allows it to maintain competitiveness. We need an economic regulatory regime that promotes investment, that works for shippers where there's a market failure and does so in a way that is timely and relatively less burdensome than it perhaps is today, yet grounded in core economic principles.
Thank you. Anybody else want to take a shot at that? Go ahead.
Congressman, if I could, so I'd agree with Mr. Jeffries that we do need to modernize and update the regulatory system. With all due respect, we've been trying for 40 years to make a broken system work. It's time to turn the page and try something new. In our view, that's reciprocal switching. That's been well discussed already, but the whole point under the Staggers Act is to increase competition among rail carriers. That's what we're trying to do here. So that would be the immediate step that's been pending at the STB for 6 years now.
Thank you.
If I can please add to that, this is Herman Hackstein. Getting effective oversight to make that competition act to create a free market type environment needs to happen. And to your point, what can we do quickly? I think we need to remove some of the barriers so that the STB can give us that effective oversight.
And I jump in real quick if I may, just streamline the processes that we have to go through. If we're bringing up issues and or concerns and or problems, let's figure out how to streamline these things to make this more efficient for everybody.
Mr. Congressman, if I'm.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the challenges, we talk a lot about staffing. And even while Mr. Jeffries may be right that certain railroads are having trouble finding employees, certain railroads still have people furloughed while they're forcing others to work more. Adding insult to injury while you're offering incentives to hire, the nation's Class 1 railroad employees have been 2 years without a contract. They worked through a pandemic. The railroads are reporting record profits. And it's an insult to everyone that you're going to pay new employees more than the ones that got you through the crisis without a contract. So there's all sorts of things that can be done to alleviate the staffing problems.
Mr. Pierce is representing the ongoing collective bargaining process that both sides have been in and continue to negotiate in.
Well, thank you very much. I think go ahead. Was there another witness? Go ahead.
Sorry, Congressman Dennis Newman from Amtrak. And I was just going to say, for a little different perspective, from our standpoint, being able to have the funding at the STB for the passenger rail office for so that efficient investigation of any performance issues that may be brought, I think would be helpful.
Well, thank you very much. As my time winds down, I appreciate those comments, and it's something that I think colleagues on both sides of the aisle within this committee are hearing. So I think that we need to work to alleviate some of these concerns and just bring certainty to the industry. And I thank you all for participating today and sharing your knowledge and expertise. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Lynch for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate it. I, for one, am very grateful to our rail workers, especially this last 2 years has been very, very difficult. They've been on the front lines and they have performed magnificently on behalf of the American people in doing what they can to alleviate the supply chain problems that we've had. I am deeply disappointed in the layoffs that we experienced early on. And part of, as a former union president myself, I can tell you, when you have layoffs in an industry, that is a red flag to anyone who's looking to begin a career in that industry, because it signals instability. And I also think that the rate of consolidation in rail has also limited our opportunity to attract more workers. They see Wall Street making more of the decisions to squeeze out employees. I think it's had a detrimental effect on the quality of life for those employees. And also, I worry about our ability to attract the next generation of rail workers. President Pierce, I've negotiated plenty of collective bargaining agreements during my career as an iron worker and also as a labor attorney. Can you talk to us about the fact that we've lost so many skilled employees? Some of them are still furloughed, yet we have another effort of bringing new people into the industry. Can you talk a little bit about the perspective of our regular rail workers and what they're dealing with on a daily basis?
Thank you, Congressman. I think it's a very critical part of what's wrong with the supply chain and what's wrong with staffing. As I said, our membership has been, and this is all rail unions, this isn't just mine. They've all been without a contract for over 2 years while the records made record profits. Every profit report that came out this spring has been best ever. And the employees see that. And new people that want to go to work in a good industry see that. The continuing attack on the second person on the train. How do you hire conductors when you're telling them you want to get rid of them? That's counterproductive. Add to this that these policies that the roads are adopting as part of PSR, forcing workers to work more, taking away their family life at the expense of laying someone else off. And it's absurd to me that there's any doubt as to why people are not interested in hiring out at the railroads right now. They're having a hard time even at job fairs. 10 people take the job, only 5 show up when they find out what it looks like. And that's my job. That's our job as unions to try to improve on that. But we need a willing partner across the table. And for 2 years, we've sat across the table with no willing partners to try to address these concerns.
Yeah, I'm not in on the negotiations, obviously, but you would think with all of the money that we have collectively in Congress sent to our rail operators, and that inducement would encourage them to be a little bit more kind to our employees. And also, we've seen that on the passenger side in my own district, where we gave the rail authority in Massachusetts about $1.5 billion, and they turned around and laid off 50 conductors. We got that turned around belatedly, but there just seems to be a disconnect between what we're all trying to do and some of the policies that we've observed. From a safety standpoint, President Pierce, how important is it to have that second employee on that train, especially given the length of some of these trains?
I think it's critical. I think the second set of eyes and ears, the ability to, address issues that happen on the fly, grade crossing accidents, derailments. These are things where the ground crew goes back in short order to make sure that we're addressing these catastrophes as fast as we can. There's no replacement for that, where you put someone on the ground in a truck and he can even get to the remote locations that conductors walk to every day from the head end of a train that's out there right where the accident occurs. So it's just one of many ways. This is a cost-cutting mechanism. It is fewer people doing more work, and it has nothing to do with the safe operation, in our opinion.
Thank you very much. Well, I have family that are involved in rail, and they've got a long history there. And hopefully you'll have greater success. I want to urge the the rail operators to sit down and bargain in good faith with our brothers and sisters in the rail unions.
May I comment quickly
Mr.
before?
Chairman, I yield back. Oh, I'm sorry, sure. If I have time, I give it to you.
Quickly.
Very quickly, very quickly. One, I'm not the negotiator. We have a separate organization that does that. Of course, we're negotiating in good faith. That's a long, gradual process. It works well under the Railway Labor Act. Number two, even in 2016, under the Obama administration, their proposed two-person crew requirement in the beginning of the rule stated there is no data to show that this rule improves safety. And three, just as a reminder, we don't take direct funds from the federal government. We're almost entirely privately financed, owned, and maintained, but your point is well taken there, and we certainly supported the infrastructure bill. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, man. The gentleman yields back. And next we have Mr. Nels for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. You can consider me a friend. I support the rail industry and appreciate everything you've done throughout this pandemic, and you do a great job for America. My question is really focused more to Mr. Newman. And I have a gentleman here, his Special Agent Michael Garbo. Special Agent Garbo was killed on October 5th, 2021. He worked for the DEA, and he was searching an Amtrak train heading from LA to New Orleans when the train stopped in Tucson, Arizona. He was doing a search of that train and found some illegal substances, illegal drugs on that train. And obviously the suspect didn't like it and ended up getting in a firefight with Agent Garbo and took his life. And looking at, this caused me to pause and look at security apparatus, the security on our rail system, and specifically Amtrak. And I believe that Amtrak lacks basic security protocols, making it appealing to drug traffickers and other criminals. And it is possible to board a train without ID and take on bags without any sort of screening. And the reason I say that is I have staff and others that have jumped on an Amtrak train from DC here to New York, and they've never been asked for an ID. They can buy a ticket, but they're not asked for an ID. Matter of fact, they can take bags on that train, and none of those bags are scanned. And I think the American people would find this very, very difficult to understand, that when you jump on an airplane, they want everything but a blood sample. But you can jump on an Amtrak train and not need any identification whatsoever and carry on bags without being scanned. And I find that very concerning. In the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, Congress has allocated over $50 billion, with a B, $50 billion to Amtrak. And Mr. Newman, you state in your testimony that Amtrak will use that funding to begin the modernization of Amtrak's assets and initiate significant expansion of Amtrak's route network. Could you tell the committee today if Amtrak is planning on using any of the $50+ billion to make basic security improvements, invest in the Amtrak police, or make the Amtrak experience safer for passengers by deterring crime on trains and in stations?
Well, Congressman, thank you very much for the question. And the short answer is yes. So that the some of the funding that's made available to us through the IIJA is available for us to use on modernizing and upgrading our systems, including our safety and security systems. We similarly are very interested in making improvements in the safety and security of our trains. Our Amtrak Police Department cooperates and works extensively with Homeland Security, TSA, and federal and local security authorities to make sure that we've got good cooperative practices in place, that we're well coordinated, and that we can do everything that we can to ensure the safety of your constituents, our passengers, and the traveling public.
But your current practice doesn't support that, because you can jump on a train from here to New York and not have an ID. True or false? That's true. You can jump on a plane without having an ID because it takes place every day.
We do have.
And you
we
can
do
jump
have
on a
open
train
access to the
with bags loaded with drugs or whatever. You don't know what's in it, and you can jump on a train without having any bags scanned. That's true too.
That is.
And
that
you
is similar
stated that you
to
got the $50 billion
public
and that money
transportation
could be
everywhere.
used, and that money could be used for safety and security enhancements, but you don't really have a plan in place. Well, I want to try to help you. I'm concerned about America. I'm concerned about our southern border. Mr. Newman, if you think about our southern border and the amount of substances and drugs coming through our southern border because we really have no border security, I think Amtrak is actually enabling the problem. Because individuals with those drugs that get through our southern border can jump on one of your trains, and you don't need an ID. You can be Billy Bob. You can be anybody you want. You can jump on that train with your drugs, your substances, and move it throughout the entire country because you're in several states. And I think that the American people should be concerned about this. I want to be proactive instead of being reactive.
And we'll give
Congressman, we'd be happy to get you more information and discuss with you and hear your ideas, give you information about what we currently do, what security practices we have in place.
So
and
my
talk
last
about
my
what-
last
what
comment
else
is that I'm drafting legislation and I want to work with you. It's called the Passenger Rail Security Improvements Act of 2022 that I'm planning on introducing this month that would improve Amtrak's ticketing and baggage processes to make it more difficult to bring illegal drugs on board. It's not going to inconvenience your riders or hamper Amtrak's operation, but I think it's important that Amtrak uses the resources it's been given to modernize its security. So I want to work with you on this. And so would you like to sit down with me at some point in time and talk about this legislation?
Yes, sir. We'd be happy to.
That's great.
And we'd
We will
welcome
be
that.
reaching out to you. Thank you, Mr. Newman.
Gentleman's
I yield
time
back.
has expired. That concludes the hearing for today. I would like to again thank each of the witnesses for your testimony today. I ask unanimous consent that the record today's hearing remain open until such as time our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may have been submitted to them in writing, and that my opening statement be put into the record as well. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days and for any additional comments or information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing without objection. This brings the subcommittee to adjournment.